Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm just going to launch a poll here real quick while you're waiting to share with us a little bit about yourself. If you're just joining us, go ahead and complete the poll, and we're going to get started in just a minute. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't had a chance to complete the poll, go ahead and do that now. I'm going to close it in just a second because we have one more poll question for you before we get started. Waiting for a few more people, and I'm going to go ahead and end it. So I get a little sense of who's here. We have some nonprofit attorneys, a lot of social service providers, interested community members, students, and other people, mental health professionals, and survivor advocates. And we have survivors here as well. We're absolutely thrilled to have all of you here today. My name is Jamie Beck. I'm the president managing attorney of Free to Thrive, and I'm beyond thrilled to be having this training for you today. We're partnered up with University of San Diego's Project Team Up, and we're going to be talking today about trauma and addiction for human trafficking survivors. We have one more poll. We're going to learn a little bit more about if you have ever had trauma training, so we get a sense of everybody's knowledge base going into this training. So go ahead and respond to that poll real quick, and then we'll dive right in. All right. So it looks like most of you have had trauma training before, which is great because this is an advanced trauma training. So I'm really glad to know that many of you have had trauma training before. We will cover a little bit of basics, but we'll also go really into the meat of this particular topic, which is the intersection of trauma and addiction. And we can go to the next slide. I am pleased to introduce our presenters for the day. We have Professor Dr. Dr. G, I'm just going to call you Dr. G, who is an amazing professor from the University of San Diego and the program director for the Opioid Workforce Expansion Program, and is really an expert in this space and has brought 3 amazing students to present with him: Lauren Flynn, Grace Wu Winquist, and Carly Smith, who will all be presenting on this topic today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them, and I look forward to learning from all of you. And we do, just before we started, I will say that we do have the chat open. If you have any comments, thoughts, feedback you want to share throughout the presentation, we'd love to make it interactive and hear from you. So feel free to put your thoughts into the chat. And if you have questions along the way, you're welcome to ask them in the Q&A. We will take questions along the way and save some time at the end for your questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Appreciate that, and welcome everyone. We're very excited to be able to partner with Free to Thrive. We respect greatly the work that Free to Thrive is doing in the community, and we're very, very honored to be able to be a part of that. As Jamie mentioned earlier, this is going to be more advanced training on trauma and addiction. So we won't go into a lot of basic concept. We'll cover just a little bit at the beginning about trauma in general regarding language that's used, and a little bit of myths that both associated with trauma and addiction. So it's going to be very brief overview. And then we're really going to move into this intersection piece of how trauma and addictions intersect and influence or impact or are relevant to survivors of human trafficking. And we're going to look at it from three perspectives. We're going to look from a perspective of a risk factor of being recruited, being vulnerable to being exposed to human trafficking. We're going to look how substance use plays a role during someone's time as a victim of human trafficking, and how it presents and plays a role, essentially being part of the vicious cycle and being kept in that. And then lastly, we're going to look a last piece of kind of post the experience of how it impacts and plays a role, prevents the survivor from actually healing and thriving in their life. So we're going to examine it from all of each point and look a little bit at the end how a trauma has a little bit of a lasting impact and some implication from the perspective. And then briefly at the end, we're going to look from impact on us as providers. What are some things for us to be cognizant of, and how substance use could be playing a role in our own life, and what are some things for us to be aware of as well. And then we wrap it up at the end and have some time. Our goal is to have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions that are broader, please feel free to leave them at the end. But if there's some things that are coming up for you, you can leave it in the chat. We'll do our best to monitor, and maybe we can answer some of these questions as we go. Carl, you can move to the next slide. We have a little bit of a pool questions. That's just to get a sense, because we're going to talk about a lot of kind of general cultural, societal perceptions about trauma and addictions. So we want to just get a sense and start conversation started. So we have three poll questions that we're going to ask. Carly is going to share a link that you can click in your chat, and on that link is going to take you to the three poll questions that we have. It's going to ask you along the lines of some things that we have learned, maybe growing up, maybe they play a role, maybe some biases that are still present in our mind about addictions, drug use as a whole, people who use them, and trauma and human trafficking as a whole. So we'll just get a little sense of, for us to be intentional, reflect on what are some things, what are some messages that we heard and are relevant to our work, relevant how survivors of human trafficking and persons who struggle with addiction use are dealing with. Carly has shared the link, so if you just click on the link, it's going to take you straight to the browser, which you can type in your response. Excellent. Those are some very, very important points. Excellent. So I'll just comment a little bit briefly without going too deep in those. And thank you all who are sharing. Most of these are reflective of what's called a moral model of addiction treatment, which means assume that substance use is as a consequence or result of a low moral standard or failed morality in a person, or a weak personhood as a whole. So we'll reflect a little bit and actually speak to substance use from a different model perspective, from a psychological perspective, to see substance use in a very different light, see it as a natural consequence or a natural coping mechanisms for experiences such as traumatic events. Carly, if you don't mind switching to the next one. So this one is, what messages have you received within your own culture regarding substance use and human trafficking? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, excellent. So a lot of this language, a lot of these messages, a typically prevalent assumption in those is usually placing a lot of blame on the survivors themselves, that the things that happen in their life are a result of their actions. Bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. Bad things are happening to you, therefore you must be a bad person. This matter of choice, that you can freely choose to do it or not to do it, this notion of choice that you can choose to stop doing it if you really wanted to, or if you were strong enough. So these are really implications that always look exclusively on the survivor for the fault and the reasons for why it's happening, and for the drive in overcoming it solely. So when we look at actually presentation today, we'll see how much that is not true and all the factors that are playing a role. And Carly, if you don't mind moving us to the last question briefly. Yep, that nothing is typically a right answer. There's very, very little entry points in which we actually gain some education. More these blanketed statements of all drugs are bad, or people who use drugs are bad. If you use drugs, therefore you become bad. That simply just do not reflect reality for what life is for a number of us. Again, excellent point. Again, placing a blame on women in particular as being their responsibility not to be hurt. Excellent. Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate it, because this really sets up our conversation today in a light. What we hope to achieve today is to be able to combat some of those. And I know that for most of you, this is not what you're truly reflective, but we want to provide a little bit of essentially scientific evidence and education around how much these things are not true, and in essence, how trauma and addiction come together and create a specific environment or situation in which people are vulnerable, and it's really, really difficult to overcome either one, because how they both together impact an individual. Okay, Carly, we can move on. Thank you all for participating in the poll as well.
Hi, everyone. So I figured with the poll that we just did and seeing a lot of the themes that we'll see on this page here, while researching, we kind of gained an understanding of some of the misconceptions that are present in the larger society. And as Dr. G highlighted, like this may not be things that we hold as true, but it's important to keep in mind while working with this population, due to the fact that these are myths that they have to face on a regular basis. I'll just give us a moment to kind of look over some of these myths and the facts that counteract them. Some of the ones that stuck out to me is quitting is a matter of willpower, and not recognizing the prolonged exposure, the impact that can have on the brain in various ways, and that someone who is a human trafficking victim could seek help if they're in public. And then lastly, that there are visual indicators that shows whether or not someone is using substances. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So just take a peek at some of these myths and facts, and we'll transition into talking briefly about some trauma-informed practices and ways to challenge bias. As people within this field, we can always be utilizing trauma-informed practices and working towards being more trauma-informed. Some ones that stuck out for me is remaining humble. We always have things to learn, and there are always opportunities to be more sensitive and serve the needs of our clients better, and empowering clients through choice and collaboration. Another one that stuck out to me was creating safety, both physically and emotionally. I feel like that emotional piece or that physical piece could sometimes be forgotten. So being mindful of ways that we can do that. And to challenge bias, some big points here that stuck out for me is our language is important. We always have to avoid stigmatizing words and having conversations around what words would be stigmatizing, and continuing to do resources. And then shifting away from some of those negative assumptions and negative biases that are present in the larger society and surrounding ourselves with the facts and things that counteract them. Once we've kind of discussed the intersectionality of human trafficking and addiction a little bit further, we'll kind of come back and touch on these more and the applications in which they can be beneficial to our field.
And Carly, let me just add one more point, if you don't mind going back, about the importance of language. And I know we're talking to Jamie, she talked about the trainings you get, most of you have witnessed in the past around trauma. So I just want to focus slightly a bit about substance use, because the language is, stigmatizing language is really, really prevalent regarding to people who use substances. So I want to just kind of put it in some tangible terms. We really want to, again, moving from stigmatizing language and moving in the person first language. So we want to acknowledge the person as a whole before any struggle, mental health issue or disorder they might have. So a person is not an addict, person is not an alcoholic. Those are things that dealing with. There is a person that we're dealing with that comes before these disorders. So it's not an addict, it's not an alcoholic, it's a person with addictive disorder. It's a person who struggles with alcohol use. So acknowledging the person first and moving from stigmatization, because in our society, being an addict, being an alcoholic means a myriad of different things that are typically associated with one's character and who the person actually is. So addiction and alcohol use problems is only a part of who they are, rather defining feature or characteristics for them. So we really, really want to focus and move away from these essentially accepted, socially accepted terms and move into acknowledging the existence of the person beyond that and only seeing this as a one part of who they are.
Okay, so the next few slides are really to give you a frame of reference of how prevalent substances are in their role in human trafficking. And so this data is provided by the Polaris Project, which is a nonprofit organization that combats sex and labor trafficking. And the National Human Trafficking Hotline is a toll-free number that survivors and victims can connect to for services and supports across the country. And so I really want to just point out this 2019 data report, because you can see that over 22,000 victims and survivors were identified through sex and labor trafficking, and with the majority in sex trafficking. And so really, I would like everyone to actually focus on the two boxes on the right-hand side. You can see that the top box shows the 5 risk factors and trafficking, the top 5 risk factors for trafficking victimization, and it breaks it down into 2 columns. So sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And under sex trafficking, you can see that number 1 is substance use concerns. In labor trafficking, it is number 5, but I just don't want anyone to dismiss the fact that it is still in the top 5 risk factors for labor trafficking. The bottom box, it's the top 5 forms of force, fraud, and coercion, broken down by sex and labor trafficking again. And substance use is, again, number 1 in sex trafficking. So really what we want you to do and take away from this data is that substance use issues and concerns are prevalent in both sex and labor trafficking. However, it plays a very large role in sex trafficking cases. In fact, it's actually the number 1 risk factor, and it's the number 1 method of coercion in sex trafficking. So these numbers, they really help us understand the importance in addressing the intersection of addiction and trauma and how often substances are used in trafficking situations. And as providers, addressing these 2 simultaneously will allow us to implement the best practices moving forward, treatments, and just give our clients the highest level of care.
Let me just add one more thing, Grace, here. Even though these graphs or these numbers paint a really telling story, even on the face value, another thing we have to consider when it comes to substance use, yes, we see substance use here highlighted as the primary risk factor. But if we look, for example, in runaway homeless youth, if we look in unstable housing, if you look into mental health concerns, substance use issues usually present here also as a secondary risk factor. So in addition to being identified as only, right, the primary piece that presents or puts someone in a risk position of being recruited for human trafficking, in addition to that, individuals who deal all these secondary, tertiary identified factors also have addiction as a underlying potential issue. So it's a risk for using substance use, which again, if you have two of these factors, increases your risk even more. So I also don't want us to lose the sight of, yes, substance use as a primary risk factor is extremely relevant, but if we take into consideration the secondary influence the substance use has for many of these other factors, then you can see that influence of substance use is greatly underestimated if we just look at the face numbers of where the substance use falls.
Thank you, Dr. G. Carly, you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So vulnerabilities in human trafficking. So we thought it was really important to showcase this data. This is from the 2019 Federal Human Trafficking Report. And this is specifically talking about the new criminal cases reported in 2019. And so this shows that the drug dependency and substance abuse is the #1 pre-existing vulnerability in criminal cases. So what does this mean? This means that traffickers, which are the defendants in these criminal cases, were found to purposely prey on individuals who are already dependent on substance use or having substance use issues. And they target these individuals because they are more vulnerable to being coerced into trafficking cases. You can see on the chart that these are some of the common risk factors. Dr. G had just touched on some of these as well, but there are some others that are individuals who lack social support, individuals who have experienced prior violence, trauma, sexual abuse, individuals with mental health issues and disorders, and also individuals from marginalized communities. Next slide, thank you. So coercion is a term that you will hear me use a lot when it comes to substance use and human trafficking. So coercion is defined by forcing a person to do something against their will by making threats against their safety, their well-being, their loved ones, and their property. So from the same report, these new criminal cases of 2019 show that 39.9% of criminal cases had defendants who are exploiting substance dependency and as coercive means. And so through our research, we actually found some cases released by the Department of Justice from 2019 and 2020, which is Prince Bixler and Brian Folks. These are two perpetrators that use drugs such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines to recruit their victims. And they would maliciously sell drugs and supply drugs to cause addiction. They would create climates of fear to continue trapping these vulnerable individuals. And so I'll dive a little bit deeper into these cases in the next slide. As a disclaimer, just some of the details I'll be sharing might be a lot to digest. So if that is the case, please feel free to step away or take some time to yourself. These cases will be available in our resources section at the end of the presentation. So if you do want to access them on your own later on, we'll have that available for you. Okay, so the role of substances in human trafficking. Some of you may have seen the AMP model before, but if you haven't, I'll just briefly go over it. The AMP model helps us determine if a potential situation fits under the federal definition of human trafficking. And there's 3 columns: the action, means, and purpose. And at least one element from each category, it needs to be present for a situation to be considered human trafficking. And so I'll speak a little bit more on the action and the means category. And I'll start off with the action category because substances can be introduced as a first point of contact when traffickers are beginning to recruit. And so the Polaris Project reports that traffickers will intentionally target drug rehabilitation centers to prey on individuals who are already struggling with substance abuse issues. Traffickers will also exploit other vulnerabilities such as homelessness, runaway youth, and sell and provide these drugs to individuals to create a substance dependency and addiction. And so once these individuals become dependent, traffickers will take advantage of forcing these victims into trafficking. And so I want to bring back the cases that I mentioned in the last slide of Brian Folks and Prince Bixler, because I think real life cases will give you an example of how substances really play a role. And so Brian Folks, he's a man that is from Burlington, Vermont. This case is from 2019, so it's very recent. And he was found guilty on 13 felony charges of his sex and drug trafficking operation. And so he sold heroin to young, vulnerable women who are already struggling with dependency on drugs. And so prior to meeting Folks, these women had already experienced trauma. They had experienced physical and sexual abuse as children. They were homeless, and they found themselves addicted to drugs. And so Folks identified these vulnerabilities in them, recruited them by supplying heroin to feed their dependency. And once he was able to recruit them, he forced them to become sex workers against their own will, and would assault them, withhold drugs if they did not perform the commercial sex acts. And so moving into like coercion and control, which is the means category, traffickers will coerce and control their victims through rewards, punishment, isolation, and perception. Substances are used as a form of rewards. So if victims are obedient and compliant to the trafficker's demands, they'll be rewarded with drugs and substances. And on the other side of the spectrum is punishment, where substances are used as a form of discipline. And an example of this form of discipline and punishment is, like I mentioned earlier, withholding substances from victims, because these cause really painful withdrawal symptoms. And it's a way for traffickers to create a climate of fear, because these withdrawal symptoms, they cause severe physical ailments and can even lead to death. And so individuals who are already dependent on drugs, they fall back into the pattern of addiction because they want to avoid these painful withdrawal symptoms. As for isolation, substances are used to isolate victims from their support systems. By perpetuating these dependencies, traffickers can drive a wedge between the victims and their family members by threatening to take away their supply of drugs, the supply of income, housing. So all of these are used to cause victims to break ties with their family members and loved ones. And then the last one is perception. So traffickers can create false perceptions of victims as coercive means. And so in the case of Brian Folks, he created a digital library containing thousands of photos and videos of victims performing humiliating sex acts. He threatened to post them publicly to expose them. And he kind of created this image that they were addicts engaging in sexual behaviors. And what people don't see on the other side is that he was physically assaulting them, and he was withholding heroin, knowing that they had a fear of withdrawal, to coerce them into these situations. Carly?
Grace, I'll just add a couple of things here, because it's important for us to now take these things in a perspective. So what Grace is talking about is absolutely true, considering how exceptionally addictive some of these substances are and how extremely difficult some of the withdrawal symptoms are. But let's look at a little bit broader picture when it comes to recruiting. Yes, substance use can be seen as a vulnerability that can be exploited, right? So someone who's already addicted to a substance can be exploited and drawn into human trafficking, or substances can be introduced as a piece to create a vulnerability, create a dependency to exploit someone, right? But the key piece here, when we look at some of these factors that create a vulnerability, the also sense of isolation. So substances are not doing this on their own. So a person who already has a substance addiction and might be struggling with the recovery or might be in relapse, part of the reason why they're vulnerable, it's not just the fact that they want the substance, but oftentimes another piece that creates such a great level of vulnerability is that they have nowhere else to go. Because the being addicted to a substance usually creates a social isolation, because our society is not all that great and is not jumping joy at an opportunity to help with to someone who has substance use issue. So part of the reason the vulnerability exists with persons who use substances is not just the physiological hook that a substance has. So let's us not look at from simple perspective, drugs are bad, they create this a great level of dependence and a person falls a victim, but rather we have to look at it from a broader perspective of societal stigma and bias that isolates this individual, that creates barriers for this individual to access anything or anybody else, right? This is also very common with the gang mentality, essentially finding the only place they fit. And in many instances, the perpetrator is the point of contact. So we have to look at this from a more complex perspective of not just vulnerability to, I need this something to satisfy my physiological need at this time, but also it goes far beyond, oh, I have nowhere else to go. And this is even further highlighted if we look at the coercion and control piece, because once that person starts using substances and becomes addicted to a substance, especially some of these substances that are very frowned upon by our society, heroin, that is scary. We don't even want to think about that, let alone talk about it, right? When a person becomes addicted to substance such as that, their circle of access decreases dramatically. It is very unlikely for a person to go to a police station and say, I am being a victim of human trafficking and the leverage that is being used is my addiction to heroin. Because if that person is to find strength to do that, well, guess what? They're most likely to be arrested and prosecuted. So we have to consider the positions of barrier and essentially walls that are built as a result of how our society perceives substances. So essentially a bias that we have and stigma that we have towards substances that extends to people who use substances is so strong that creates barriers to helping victims of human trafficking at all, creates a barrier that they cannot pass through to access help. And if they were to pass, they're most likely to be seen through the lens of you doing this thing, you're doing it to yourself, you're responsible for it, or in many unfortunate instances, you deserve it. So we cannot only look this from perspective, substances are bad, they get so badly addicted, they are not in control on their own mind. Even though the substance use in itself is a powerful tool, social isolation, stigmatization of people who use substances is in many instances far greater to overcome in order to seek help than the substances on their own.
Thank you, Dr. G. Okay, so we are now going to show just a 6-minute video of a woman named Allie, and she just talks a little bit about her trafficking situation and how traffickers have a hold on their victims. So Carly, if you could please play the video. Thank you.
I think when I was first, on the streets, I still kind of separated myself from everybody else that was down there and looked at myself as like unique, that like, I'm not as bad off of as these people. I'm not as dirty as these people. I haven't, done certain things yet. I haven't been arrested yet. Like I'll be fine.
Kensington Avenue runs under an elevated train, they call it the L. So it's kind of like a hallway almost, where it's the stores and then there's the train platform. So there's no sunlight, there's nothing like that. It's inner city. There's trash, there's everything you could think of. It's abandoned buildings, abandoned factories, abandoned houses. And then there's the heroin, and there's on every street corner down there, there's dealers. You can't go anywhere without running into dealers.
It went from trying it, probably to within a month, like needing to do it every single day. So when I moved down there, like it was very bad. It wasn't about like the thrill of getting high. It was like, I need this, or like I feel like I'm gonna die because I'm getting that sick.
That's one of the tools that the pimps use to keep these girls under control and keep them in the working status, because they need the drugs, they need the money to get the drugs. So that's a big key factor in their control over these girls.
In the beginning, it's easy for them to manipulate you when you have nothing, and they're literally providing you with everything. And they have that control over you. It kind of became just like giving in to them, because I felt obligated, to do certain things with them in order for them to keep providing for me. If they would be physically abusive towards you, then they would remind you that they were like your primary source of income, your primary, place to have a roof over your head, to feed you. So even though that part of it was there, it's kind of like you were willing to sacrifice. I was willing to sacrifice enduring that, because without that person, like I thought I had nothing.
We ran into her, and she didn't fit. She didn't belong. She was clean. That's a big thing. And she was dressed nice. And that didn't fit. And then after we talked to her, she was educated. It all didn't jive. He
probably first met me when I had just gotten out there, and I wasn't, as bad off or as beaten up as I was, years later, when he found me again.
Then the second time, it's like, all right, you're back down here, what's going on? And the progression started, where she just kept getting worse and worse and worse, and deeper into Kensington, where she couldn't get out.
It's honestly like a war zone is how I would describe Kensington. I normalized it so much, but most of what goes on there is, drugs, prostitution, and violence. It's crazy when I think about it now, because it's no way for a person to live.
Finally, at some point, her mom actually reached out to me and wanted me to, see if I could find her. They wanted to get her help and get her off the street and out of what she was doing and where she was.
I had alienated myself from them for so long, lied to them, stole from them, had them searching for me for months, putting out missing persons reports for me. There had been warrants out for my arrest because I had failed to appear in court for months, like I was running from the police. And Detective Johnson was on the warrant unit at that time. I remember I was walking down a one-way street this way, and I see a truck go this way. And for a split second, I thought about running. He got out of the car and he handcuffed me. And he literally called my mom on the phone to say, like, we found your daughter. So that day that he arrested me, it's kind of like I had that moment of clarity where I realized that I was going to be in trouble because I was going to be in jail. But I also had that sense of relief that was a little scary, because I knew that it was over. I knew that the way that I was living and, my days on the streets and years of living that way was ending. So as scared as I was, it was almost relieving in a sense to know, like, even if this is forced, like, my life doesn't have to be like this anymore. Looking back, like that day, he saved my life in the sense that had he not gotten me then, like, I don't think that I would have made it off of the streets alive had I continued to stay out there.
I don't look at it like that, like I saved her life. I mean, now sitting back after she said it, yeah, but that's what I was supposed to do. That was my job. That's what the task force, everybody was here to do. That's what we're supposed to do, is help these girls get off the street.
Whether it's, addiction or prostitution or human trafficking, it doesn't discriminate against any, socioeconomic status or any background. Even me in the beginning thought, like, I come from a good family, an educated family, a good area, like this could never happen to me. Like, I was one of those naive, ignorant people that didn't think it could happen to me, as though I was above other people. But it can happen to anybody. You don't have to come from, a bad home or live in the inner city where that stuff might be misconceived as being more prevalent. Like it happens everywhere. It can happen to anybody.
Excellent. So we would like to just take a moment and think about this video a little bit, and I have a couple of reflecting pieces that I would like to ask, or some questions I would like to ask, and if you don't mind sharing your thoughts. And you can share your thoughts either through the chat, or I'm not sure if you have ability to just unmute yourself and share your thoughts from that perspective. But a couple of things. The first thing I'll just like to ask after watching this 5-6 minute video, what are some things that stood out to you the most? So what are some, after watching this, what is like, okay, this really stands out to me, this, I find this particularly important or relevant? So some things that we see in the chat is can happen to anyone, master's degree, how quickly it can happen. Excellent point. What else? Wondering about decriminalizing sex work as a whole? Absolutely. Naivete, individualization, criminalization, absolutely. A lot of these factors that are playing a role. Excellent. Another question that I want to ask now, since we started talking a little bit about stigmatization and bias, are you seeing any points in which stigma in itself presented in this video, maybe in language, on treatment of the person, or potentially do you see stigma from the perspective that we discussed a little bit today as a barrier? Do you see in any way that played a role of creating a barrier or preventing access to help in any way? Yes, excellent point. I'm really glad many of you are picking up on this. So essentially, perception, I'm doing things wrong, or in many ways it can be I am wrong for doing these things. So essentially, the perception, yes, absolutely, talking about what we mentioned earlier, how addictive the drug was, how quickly it progressed for her in this case to be addicted to drug, the role it played, the drug in itself, but also this perception. These people who, again, our perception as a society, having these task force, the meaning behind the task force is to provide help, to protect these individuals or persons who are struggling or who are victims of human trafficking. So that's what we as a society dedicated to. But her first perception wasn't I am saved, even though, yes, there was a later sentiment, but there was this also I'm in trouble. So there's this barrier of being in trouble, of doing something wrong by this happening or facing this. So some of the other things that we would like you to consider is even from the perspective when she shared earlier in the stories, essentially barriers of these internalized barriers or internalized degrees of separation of being better than drugs. So even she talking about separating herself or seeing herself better than these people, whatever that in many ways for her that meant drugs, right? She was clean at that time. So there was the separation, even though I'm doing all these things by the very fact that I'm not using drugs makes me better. Another point, and I think this is a great addition to myths that we discussed earlier about drug use when she talked about when it came to drug use, by the time I was addicted to this substance, it wasn't anymore about the thrill of getting a high, but about survival. And that's a great misconception we have about drug use. We see them as selfish people who just want to have great time, who want to be high and experience this great pleasure. And that's why the life is falling apart. But rather, once addiction progresses, it's nothing to do with being having a good time or experience quote unquote high for the source of pleasure. High becomes for the source of avoiding pain. And with trauma, this is particularly relevant because there's not just avoiding pain from withdrawal and physiological consequences of drug use, but actually pain associated with trauma. If you have a PTSD or you have been molested as a child and you have recurring nightmares and you have intrusive thoughts, well, guess what? A heroin or getting drunk in many ways for that moment in time is a blessing that can come. That could potentially be, for the time being, the only way that you can get rid of all these terrible things that are ever so present in your mind and might be the only way that you achieve sleeping. So now adding how we conceptualizing drugs from the physiological perspective, sociological barrier, but also this psychological utility, and Lauren will talk a little more later, of psychological utility of preventing, right, serving as a coping mechanism, helping us escape, but not just escape from a sense of I'm escaping physical pain, which was referred to in the video, but from a broader sense of potentially escaping psychological pain as well. And then another point that I wanted to bring up was there was no alternatives, right? For her, when she started experiencing this, there was nothing else. So she even said at some point, I thought I had nothing, right? So he speaks of this coming from an affluent family, all those things. But once you start experiencing this, once you are a survivor, once you're a victim of human trafficking and you are addicted to drugs, the perception of this, there's no place in the society for me. So that's really, really important for us to consider. There's no place for me to be, there's no place for me to go. So this isolation, we are really quick to blame the drugs for feeling isolation, being cooked, being addicted, but this feeling isolation comes in association with those factors rather from then in some kind of linear, direct, consequential manner. So those are really, really important things to consider. I know there was a lot of things in the chat and I'm not able to monitor it all. So if there are any questions that I can come across, we can maybe come back later, but we'll move on to the next slide now.
I just think I wanted to highlight, some people had mentioned that like the idea of that, you know, she didn't look like a type, and that can be related to the aspect of like privilege and being someone who visibly presents as a white individual. And I think that's important just to touch on and make sure that we highlight that the chat brought that up.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up, Carly. So absolutely, privilege is stigmatization, discriminate. Same as our society does, there's another level of stigmatization. So actually, in my own research, I'm looking into this cross-section of stigmatization between substance use and race in particular, because dependent on a person's race, how they are treated or expected. For example, if this was a Black girl, maybe the expectation wouldn't be she didn't fit, but rather she fits, right? So we have to acknowledge that even how the social services, police force treat individuals is greatly dependent on their sense of privilege and how they appear to be. So essentially, we have to take that in consideration of what would the experience and how invested potentially the system would be in helping her if demographic presentation was different and this person was different, let's say, race or ethnic background. So absolutely play a role, and we know the stigmatization and how the minority persons are treated by the justice system is greatly influenced by substance use. So greatly influenced in the rates of arrest, greatly influenced in rates of prosecution, greatly influenced in the length of sentences and whether they have a chance of parole. So at all points, again, substance use directly influence those in connection with the race and ethnicity of an individual. So absolutely in no way is it even. And for many individuals from disadvantaged background, this particularly terrible situation becomes particularly more terrible. Carly, we can go to the next. Yes.
Okay, so which substances are used in human trafficking and why? So we've talked a lot about drugs and substances. So I really want to talk specifically about the ones that are present in human trafficking cases. And so 4 main classes of substances used in these cases are opioids, stimulants, marijuana, excuse me, and alcohol. And I'll speak a little bit more on opioids and stimulants since most people are aware of the effects of alcohol and marijuana, and then Dr. G can jump in for any additional information on that. So starting off with opioids, the main types that are used are heroin, fentanyl, and prescription medications such as Oxycontin, Vicodin. A high-level overview of the effects of opioids is that the drug essentially binds to receptors in our brain and our spinal cord and areas in our body, which reduces the feeling of pain. In addition, there's an excess of the neurotransmitter dopamine that's released, and that creates feelings of pleasure and euphoria. So to bring that all back together, the takeaway is that opioids are a pain reliever and they cause feelings of pleasure and euphoria. And so opioids are highly addictive, and with continued use and with continued use, people can build a tolerance to this drug. So that means that they will need to take a higher dosage to achieve the same effect of when they were first using the drug. And so traffickers, they use opioids to perpetuate a dependency. I've mentioned this a few times, but they weaken the victims by worsening their addictions, and they maintain control of their victims by threatening to withhold these substances. And so withdrawal symptoms, they typically begin about 24 hours after stopping use. And some of these include restlessness, tremors, seizures, hallucinations, depressed mood, thoughts of self-harm. So there's a lot of fear that comes from experiencing these withdrawal symptoms. And so victims are continuing using opioids because they want that pain relief, because they want that euphoric feeling, but also because they fear those symptoms as well. And so stimulants, some of the common stimulants are cocaine and methamphetamines, better known as meth. And traffickers will use these drugs to increase the victim's stamina, their energy, their confidence, so they can continue trafficking their victims for as long as possible. And victims, they use these stimulants because they make sex acts, well, they can make sex acts more bearable. They create feelings of pleasure and euphoria, and they really just help victims briefly escape their current situation. So the withdrawal symptoms that come with stimulants, they actually happen within a few hours of stopping use. And those include chills, anxiety, irritability, impaired memory, and dulled senses.
Yeah, so I'll add a couple of things about opiates and stimulants, and then I'll speak a little more to marijuana and alcohol, and because they're really widely present, but they impact or person in a particular way that's relevant to survivors of trauma. But just to add to opioids, in addition to what Grace described, they also create a sensation of numbing. So actual physical experience of an act is lessened during that time. So you can imagine for a person who is being forced to participate in a sexual act, having a numbed experience during that act is greatly beneficial. So in addition to all these factors, also just having numbed experience that is not as vivid, and also opioids play a role in actually transitional short-term to long-term memory. So even prevention of memory, capturing that memory is also really, really helpful. So kind of being out of it in sense of physiological and from a perspective of memory creation, opioids are really, really effective. On the other hand, what Grace talked about, withdrawal from opioids is very, very difficult. It's very, very unpleasant. Actually, most of the colloquial terms we have associated with withdrawals, it comes from withdrawing from opioids. The term quitting cold turkey refers from when you are withdrawing from opioids because of temperature difference in your body. Our skin looks like a plucked turkeys with the little bumps. So that comes from withdrawal from opioids. And also kicking the can, referring to kicking your habit, also comes from withdrawals from opioids, because during the withdrawals from opioids, there's convulsions that usually take place with people that actually quite literally kick the can. So again, most of these colloquial terms we have associated with withdrawals is associated with opioids and how severe it is. Regarding stimulants, when persons use stimulants, they don't have to eat a lot and they can stay awake for a very, very long time, which is very advantageous for perpetrators of human trafficking. In addition to that, they're effective in increasing sexual stimulation and actually can be used actively during a sex act. So actually applying cocaine to sexual organ increases and intensifies experience of sex and arousal, so it can be used actively. Again, that ends up being expensive, so most often methamphetamine as a stimulant is also used because it's far cheaper than that. But perpetrators sometimes use it physically to stimulate victims of sex trafficking, to induce them to continue having sexual intercourse, or to keep them awake, decrease their appetite, which again keeps the body slimmer. So it has a multitude of chain effects on the victims. And regarding to marijuana, in addition to the popular knowledge about marijuana impact it has on relaxation, it also impacts what are called cannabinoid receptors, and the cannabinoid receptors have an impact on one's experience of physical pain. That's why there's a lot of proposing a medical use of marijuana is actually with persons who have chronic health issues to decrease experience of pain. So marijuana in this instance, in addition to what we kind of colloquially know about it, also plays a role in decreasing the experience of physical pain and could act in many ways as a pain blocker. And then lastly, alcohol is a sedative, which again sedates and decreases experiences, decreases the use of prefrontal cortex, and makes experiences more bearable. So being drunk quite literally removes or sedates your body to being more numb, similar to opioids, and again prevents from long-term memory integration. So those are very specific facts in addition to what we typically associate with those drugs that play a role specifically with victims of human trafficking while they're being affected.
Okay, so Dr. G introduced this topic a little bit in his commentary, but I will be looking specifically at the intersection between trauma and survivor substance use. We can't really understand human trafficking without understanding its relationship to trauma. And similarly, we can't really understand addiction without understanding how trauma plays a role. So we will be looking at substance use as a trauma response, a response to the psychological, neuro and biological, social and environmental impacts of trauma. And I think a nice place to start in understanding this trauma landscape is with this quote by Bessel van der Kolk. And it reads, "Being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, unchangeable and immutable, as if every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past." As we begin to look at the intersection of trauma and substance use, it's important to bear in mind that trauma can manifest itself in a variety of ways. We often think of the common representation of post-traumatic symptoms, where substances can be used to alleviate symptoms such as hyperarousal, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, and sleep disturbances. But trauma can manifest itself in a variety of other disorders that can see temporary relief through substance use. So depressive substance or sedatives can temporarily reduce the severity of symptoms such as agitation, distress, or interpersonal difficulties and anxieties that are associated with anxiety disorders, attachment issues, sexual dysfunction, and psychotic disorders. Also, stimulants can be used to provide a euphoric feeling that can counteract feelings of depression, negative feelings of mood disorders, and then also what was previously mentioned, that it can help to alleviate symptoms of chronic pain.
Lauren, if you don't mind, I'll just add a little bit. And this slide in itself represents kind of embodiment of what we in many ways talk about trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care is not just responding to a person when they disclose your trauma to you, but rather having this informed lens of potential broad impact of traumatic experiences. So not considering a person who has trauma is going to present by having intrusive thoughts, having anxiety, and not being able to fall or stay asleep. Some of these more apparent. But from trauma-informed perspective means we want to have a far broader look into how trauma can present in one life. And taking into consideration some of these issues, for example, chronic pain, eating disorder, sexual dysfunction, inability to create intimacy, the difficulty sustaining relationships. So some of these more subtle ways in which people's lives are impacted. So when working with the clients that you're working with, whatever agency you might be dealing with, it's considering that some of these other broader perspective and symptomology. So not to be singularly focused, so this is the ideology, this is the symptomology, and this is the cause of it, but rather to broaden that perspective and consider, could this potentially be caused or as a result of a traumatic event? And it doesn't necessarily mean all the way to the other end, treating or considering every person has had a traumatic event in the past, but rather taking a more informed position of seeing if maybe one symptom doesn't add up, but 2 or 3 or 4 that could kind of point to the same direction. Well, then maybe a little bit of more direct assessment in that case. So really, from this slide, we hope you take is broadening your perspective of what traumatic experiences, or rather consequences of traumatic experiences, could look like, taking that approach when working with your clients.
Thank you. So as we mentioned, substances can provide relief from chronic, severe, and distressing conditions. I think this relief is best understood through the concept of self-medication theory. And what self-medication theory suggests is that use develops as a way of coping with distress in the absence of adequate solutions. So this can look like many different ways, but substance use can provide escape. So that would allow individuals to feel less connected to and present in a body that's been traumatized or brutalized. And it can also provide escape from kind of constant and prevalent traumatic memories and thoughts. Self-numbing is another attempt at self-medication, which can reduce chronic physical pain, psychological distress, and persistent thoughts that result from the trauma. But substances can also provide a sense of vitality and be used as an attempt to provide life with stimulation, enjoyment, or liveliness as a respite from a life that lacks meaning and connection. The impacts of trauma can manifest, as I mentioned, in so many ways. So biologically, psychologically, in our interpersonal relationships, socially and environmentally, and all of these different changes. And we can look at the functions of substances and with compassion and understanding as to why someone might engage in substance use to alleviate pain, but we still might see addiction as a choice. However, it's often the case that substance use is the only option and means for continued survival. But so next, what we're going to look at is the neurobiological impacts of substance use and how the trauma creates these structural and functional changes that also impact substance use. So, as it says, trauma causes structural and functional abnormalities in several areas of the brain that result in changes to behavior, emotional response, and cognitive ability. So first, looking at the hippocampus, this is the area that aids in memory and learning, including memories of safety and trauma. I'm sorry, safety and danger. But in instances of trauma, the hippocampus shrinks. So this shrinking can lead to confusion around trauma memories and flashbacks. So someone who has damage to this area of their brain might use substances to, one, help to escape from those flashbacks, but two, also to cope with the emotional responses that come with those memories and come with those flashbacks. Next, looking at the hypothalamus. So this area of the brain signals adrenal glands production of stress and hormones. When this area is impacted by trauma, it kind of disbalances the production of hormones in the body, leading to heightened states of stress and anxiety. So depressive substances or depressants and sedatives can be used in this situation to kind of provide a sense of regulation to a dysregulated symptom and address that heightened state of anxiety and provide relief. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for complex thinking, decision-making, and appropriate behavior. Trauma can weaken the signals in this area of the brain, which means that the brain can be overwhelmed by emotion, and the person's ability to use critical thinking and kind of develop a rational response in this situation is diminished. So this can look like reduced control over someone's ability to provide critical thinking before engaging in their substance. In that case, the substance becomes more of an automatic response to an overwhelming emotional state. And then lastly is the amygdala. So this area of the brain functions as the alarm for stressful events and aids in the protection against danger. So when trauma causes changes to this area of the brain, this part stays in a state of overdrive and overactivation. So this is what kind of creates that hyperarousal. Similar to the hypothalamus, when these areas of the brain are damaged, our bodies are in this prolonged state of heightened awareness and anxiety, and sedatives and depressants are incredibly helpful in reducing those heightened states and kind of providing a sense of regulation for a body and a brain that has been in a prolonged state of dysregulation. So overall, substance use can kind of provide a sense of relief to symptoms that survivors feel, and that substances becomes a learned response that survivors can rely on.
Excellent, Lauren. I'll just add a couple of points. So absolutely great kind of overall cover and how specifically substances play with each part of the brain. I'll just look a little from a more a holistic perspective and introduce a couple of pieces. So one piece I want for us to consider is that hippocampus and hypothalamus play a role in what it's called contextualizing memories. I use a simple example to demonstrate it. For example, when we are in a car accident, amygdala gets very, very reactive and it has this emotional memory imprint. So amygdala will remember driving, extremely aroused, car crash equals danger. So amygdala will only have this emotional impression of driving a car equals danger now at the end. What hippocampus and hypothalamus do is actually integrate the contextual information when the amygdala is not triggered. So hypothalamus and hippocampus will play a role in essentially contextualizing that experiences. It was raining, the car was driving very fast, and then the driver who caused the accident maybe had a DUI, swerved in and hit our car without us being in any fault. So hypothalamus and hippocampus hold all this information and contextualize our experience of being in a car accident. However, during a stressful situation, a traumatic event, a simple one here, amygdala acts the most and weakens the hypothalamus and hippocampus, and essentially this contextual information doesn't translate. That's why, for example, some people who were in a car accident now just being in a presence in being a car have flashbacks because their brain only remembers being in a car and danger. the contextual part of the memory is not translated and was not integrated. And this is where substances play a role because of this great level of anxiety that's experienced in danger. Imagine living in today's world that you cannot go in a car or maybe be out on the street. For example, in instances with human trafficking survivors, that substance use play a role in decreasing the anxiety, so on simplest level. And then also we as human beings have the need to holistically be in touch with our memory. So this fragmented experience is not natural to us. So we have a compelling need for that. And substance use plays a role in easing anxiety from the fragmentation that happens as a result of stress. And then we also know in instances when great stress takes place, the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus, what's also called the primitive or the reptilian brain, they take over. And as long as we stay in this state of arousal, which victims of human trafficking continuously do for a long time, the prefrontal cortex is not engaged. So even from that perspective of decision-making or sound decision-making, in addition to barriers that we talked about when it comes to substances, also this executive functioning, just a result of neurological impact, is also impaired. So that places another level of barrier that for the survivors of human trafficking to be able to seek help and make what we consider sound messages in any sense.
Okay, thank you. So I think this kind of goes off of those comments that you were adding, is that the additional challenges that the changes in the brain function causes is that it creates difficulty in recovering or attempting to gain sobriety and maintain sobriety. So these structural and functional changes kind of maintain the reliance on that substance. So first, looking at neural pathways. So the brain works in kind of the saying goes, the neurons that fire together wire together. So our brains work in a use-dependent manner. And what this means is that the actions, decisions, and associations that we make regularly become much more easy to make, but they also become much more difficult not to make. And so what this looks like in terms of substance use is that when substances are used to alleviate stress, regulate a dysregulated symptom or system, and then provide relief to chronic pain, that becomes paired with that substance. So this kind of strengthens that neural pathway and creates a strong connection to that. So next, looking at the hippocampus. So the shrinking of the hippocampus, as I mentioned, reduces ability to learn new coping skills. So this means that if the survivor has, going back to our list of many disorders, has one or several of those disorders or diagnoses, they are dealing with chronic and severe symptoms. And if they are not able to learn new coping strategies to deal with the distress or heightened anxiety or symptoms of depression, then the only thing that we know that works is that substance. So it makes it very difficult to find something else that is effective to help have a life that's manageable and one where our symptoms are not debilitating. Next, looking at the prefrontal cortex. So it is the part of the brain that is responsible for thinking and planning, but it's also the part of the brain responsible for imagination and kind of planning for the future. So damage to this part of the brain makes it difficult for individuals to imagine a future where they aren't dependent on that substance. So these three areas, damage to these, the changes caused to these three areas from trauma create significant difficulties of ever really overcoming that substance dependence. In addition to these three things that I did not include on here is that when someone is working towards sobriety and is coming off of those substances were incredibly effective in the role that they were playing. So they were incredibly effective in numbing strong emotions, and they're incredibly effective in suppressing memories. So when they're no longer using those substances and those feelings become more raw and those memories come back, that can trigger someone to go back into their substance, kind of maintaining this cycle. Okay, so, and then lastly, looking at the social environmental implications of trauma. First, looking at the interpersonal impact. Interpersonal trauma, such as domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking, really has a detrimental impact on a person's ability to connect with, relate to, and trust other people. So someone who is traumatized, lonely, and is attempting to make connections with others might use substances like depressants and substances that can help kind of reduce those alarms in their head and reduce those anxiety symptoms and trauma responses in order to help them connect with others, at least on a physical level. Looking at criminalization of survivors, it is an extension of trauma, and that's really the lens that I want to look at it through, is that experiences of human trafficking and substance use can lead to the criminalization of survivors as they're being punished for what may be viewed or appear to be willing involvement in the actions or recreational substance use. This criminalization creates significant psychological distress in addition to everything else that was experienced, in addition to economic challenges, social challenges, and all of the others that are playing a role in continuing to maintain a survivor's reliance on substances to cope and kind of move throughout their daily life. And then lastly, looking at the emotional toll of the legal system. It's important to understand that survivors' involvement in the court and legal system is not only emotionally taxing, but it's also an ongoing experience of their trauma, particularly for survivors of color and working with a historically discriminative system. So, in looking at that, that's why it is so important for us as practitioners and as providers to be using trauma-informed care. And that's the next thing that we'll be going into.
Can we just call up for one quick second? There are a couple of questions that I want to answer that were asked in the group. One was asked about the SGBT ganglion shot for PTSD. I apologize to this person. I tried to answer in writing, but I hit the wrong button, so I'll answer in person. And this is essentially an anesthetic shot that is given in the neck to hit particular parts of the brain that's showing to be effective with PTSD symptoms. Again, not trauma resolution, but rather symptoms associated with PTSD. There are some studies that are finding that to be effective. I myself don't know much about it. These studies are relatively new, but I just want to make sure I distinguish that those treatments are typically looking to treat the symptoms, so attacking symptoms. And from a perspective of symptom relief for a time being, and to help person maybe enter treatment and be in treatment, yes, I think it can be effective, but I don't want us to look from a simplistic way that is somehow a solution or a treatment for the trauma in itself. It looks like it could be helpful in addressing symptomology associated with PTSD. But from a longer term perspective, a person getting better, the trauma in itself has to be resolved, because as with any part of the body, if you're treating anesthetic, you're not addressing the cause of the problem, you're managing the symptom so a person could live at the time. So from that perspective, yes, it could help, if especially if this symptomology is very, very severe, it could help bring it to a bearable level so the person maybe could enter the treatment, but not to look at it as a simplistic or linear way to address the trauma in itself. And then, so the treatment, more holistic resolution of trauma is necessary. And another question asked about long-term effects on executive functioning. The answer is yes and no. There is some qualitative changes to one's ability to exercise. To exercise executive functioning doesn't change. So a person doesn't become like unable to use prefrontal cortex in the future. So like some kind of, let's say, ability or the height or depth of the executive functioning doesn't change. But what does change is our a natural response to use it. So when we are in trauma, especially for would be relevant for survivors of human trafficking who might have been exposed traumatic experience for a prolonged period of time, and essentially their meaning creation has changed, their relationship to people, their relationship to the world has been altered, their natural ability to engage in, let's say, executive functioning or critically resolving a problem might be impaired, and the natural tendency would be to react from an emotional flight or fright place to keep themselves safe rather than critically evaluate the situation and make a critical decision that will be long-term beneficial. So their ability in itself to do that and think through doesn't change, but their tendency and natural reaction to engage that as the first option does change. And that's why treatment, resolution of trauma, and the last piece, reintegration, essentially training ourselves to engage in that process primarily versus having an emotional safety reaction first would be critical. So change does happen in our tendency to want to do that, but our ability to engage in that thing does not change. So I think we covered most of these. Carly, is this you or me?
This is me. I was just going to say, we kind of covered some of these and some other ones that we just wanted to highlight that weren't on the other slides is just to remain in a strengths-based approach. Look for the strengths, find ways to empower your clients, and help find ways that we can support them and keep the relationship open and collaborative. And then our last section here is talking about vicarious trauma signs and symptoms. Given the nature of these cases, vicarious trauma can occur within ourselves, and vicarious trauma refers to the negative changes and impacts that we could see within ourselves as a result of repeated empathetic engagement with our clients. And some ones to be mindful of here, we have them divided in physical, emotional and cognitive, and behavioral. We've highlighted the substance use one because that's what we're talking about today, and to be mindful that given all the reasons discussed to experience vicarious trauma, we become more vulnerable to these signs and symptoms that can occur within ourselves. And with that, Dr. G.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this. Again, vicarious trauma is a real thing. There's a lot of literature that specifically talked about that being exposed to stories of traumatic events and instances of traumatic events puts a great risk for providers to experience vicarious trauma. And guess what? The experience of vicarious trauma is not that greatly different from the trauma itself. So the experience of itself and how it feels for you could be greatly the same. And I want to highlight substance use here very similar way we talked about with those facts and statistics, maybe not as a primary thing, but as a secondary risk factor that could be used as a coping mechanism. If a day feels particularly terrible based on a story, based on a case you're working with, that again, it could be a tendency that this is a normal, natural way to cope. All of us do that. If you use some of the substances to cope, doesn't mean you have an addiction issue. But again, I want you to be aware that it does present a risk factors from the secondary perspective that could be influencing as well.
Thank you. And last, we have it open for questions. I haven't noticed any questions that we haven't addressed yet, but I encourage take a moment. If you do have a question, you can unmute if that's better for you, or type it in the chat and we'll do our best to address it. Oh, sorry. You're muted, Dr. G.
All right, since we don't, I'll repeat what I just said when I was on mute. Since we don't have any questions coming up now, Carly, let's move to the next slide because I think it will be helpful for us just to consider how do you practice self-care? And we actually have a way for us to all engage and maybe have some tool to live with. So if Carly, you don't mind putting in a chat the link from Jamboree. Essentially, all of us will have an opportunity to contribute what we do for our self-care and be able to put a sticky note that everybody has access to. So if you have something that is particularly relevant for you, that you do and like to do, and again, those doesn't have to be some of these socially approved, inspirational, I work out every morning when I get up, I eat healthy food every Tuesday. It doesn't have to be along those lines, but rather whatever that is that fills your cup, that you engage. If you don't mind putting a sticky note, since everybody is going to have access to this, it could serve as a reminder for you, but it can also provide resources for others of things to consider. So you will have access to this. Jamie will share this with you. Therapy, I love that. Whoever is posting it, yes, I highly encourage counseling and therapy. So this, you will have this resource, you will have this resource after this is done for you to kind of reference back and think what some of these things maybe I can engage or could be helpful, seems attractive to you. In addition to this resource, we also have a list of resources that you'll have access to on the next slide that have some podcasts, for example, just about human trafficking, some practices. Then we'll have actually 2 articles that reference the cases that Grace was talking about, and some of the TED Talks that speak addiction in a little bit of a different sense. So we talked about, I referred to addiction being conceptualized from a moral perspective, like moral failure. Lauren talked about it from perspective of a coping mechanism. And then these 2 podcasts will talk about from the disease or medical model, which is mainly present. So maybe many of you heard about it being conceptualized from that perspective. And then also something that is relatively a novel way to look at it is looking in addiction a very different way. We're not looking at addiction on a continuum, being addicted and being abstinent from substance use, but actually introduces a whole new perspective of how to consider addiction and what overcoming addiction would be. So essentially introduces a whole new factor on this other side, which you usually just consider to be abstinence from substance use. But again, you will have this presentation, you will have access to these pieces. I believe Jamie will send that to you. And Carly, if you don't mind.
You're muted again.
I know, I did that again. Carly, if you don't mind stopping the presentation so we can have the full screen. If there are any questions, or Jamie, if you would like to any last thoughts.
I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, and I know we are just about out of time. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of you so much. I see some great feedback in the chat box, and really this content is phenomenal. For those of us doing this work, I'm thinking so much about the clients that we work with and the stories I've heard as you're all talking, and it really resonates. And I'm particularly grateful to all of you for using such empowering and trauma-informed language. It's really amazing to hear all of you, and I'm very encouraged to know that that Dr. G, that you are here in San Diego with this amazing expertise that can contribute to all of us and our learning in this area, and that you're teaching your students this content. And thank you, all of you. You are phenomenal presenters. You are going to be amazing counselors. And I'm just very grateful for all of you. And I really wish I could take one of your classes, because I'm sitting here going, oh, this is so amazing. I bet even in a virtual setting, you're so engaging, and it's very hard to do. So thank you. Just pure gratitude.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm
I
very
hope you
grateful
all have a
for the
great
work
rest.
that Free to Thrive does. So again, I want to thank you for all the work that you and everybody in this presentation who was present do. And then again, to give a huge shout out to 3 of my students who were the driving force behind this presentation. So I want to give them all the credit for the content that was delivered today.
Absolutely phenomenal. Thank you all. And for our audience, we do have some really great trainings coming up, particularly parts 2 and 3 of our trainings on the intersection between the API community, the Asian Pacific Islander community, and human trafficking. If you missed the first one last week, it actually already is on our website. You can catch up and then see the next 2. And just so you know, you will be receiving an email with the recording of this presentation along with the slides. I know some of you asked for that. So we'll send that out probably today or tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that, and feel free to send it along to others. If there's other people that you think should watch this content, please feel free to share it with them. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care and be well, everybody. Bye-bye.